Please come in the front, as we still have some room. Perfect. Welcome to this session. Chris, are you there? This is our first hybrid session, which means we'll have people participating online and you here. We will have, hi Chris. Can you hear us?
Hamjambo, mabimina bobwana, and karibu sana. Welcome everyone to the IFRC Global Innovation Summit. It's great to have you here both in Nairobi and on YouTube. And we'd like to welcome you to our session, Personalization Equals Dignity, where we will discuss a number of questions and topics surrounding digital engagement with communities. We work with communities all around the world. As we consider incorporating digital technologies into our core work, how will we equitably and safely engage using digital means? How can we best conduct our work throughout the network and to collaborate together to improve the sustainable use of data products and digital services? What are some of the concerns and opportunities to transform our engagement with people in need of assistance? Today, we have a distinguished panel that will discuss what is the potential future for our engagement and what should we be considering as we digitally transform and mature. My name is Chris Hoffman, and I'm the Technical Advisor at the Department of Digital Transformation of the IFRC, working on digital engagement hubs. I spent more than 20 years in the humanitarian sector, operating predominantly in emergency contexts in the United Nations and international NGOs. Let me introduce you to the rest of our panel. First, my co-host and moderator, Patricia Mugenzi, is there in the crowd in Nairobi, and I'm going to pass it over to Patricia, who is the coordinator for strategic foresight for the African region at the Solferino Academy. She's a professional with a background in international relations, specialized in forecasting long-term consequences of short-term measures, with a broad band of knowledge in assessing foreign and local laws, regulations, and socio-political factors and their potential impact on countries' policies. Patricia, can we hear a hello from you?
Thank you, Chris. What Chris didn't actually tell you is that I'm a stunt woman in my spare time. Thank you very much, Chris, for the introduction. Next to me, I'm happy and honored to introduce you Secretary General Kpawuru Sende. Mr. Kpawuru Sende has served as the CEO since 2018 and has successfully led the National Society through various critical humanitarian situations, including Ebola and COVID-19 outbreaks. Over to you, Chris. I'll let you introduce the other panelists that we have.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Patricia. I really appreciate it, and welcome Secretary General Sende. Right now, I'd like to introduce one of the keynote speakers of our group, who is Payal Arora, who is a digital anthropologist and a TEDx speaker and an author of award-winning books, including The Next Billion Users with Harvard Press. Her expertise lies in the user experience in the Global South and inclusive design. Several international media outlets have covered her work, including the BBC, The Economist, Quartz, TechCrunch, the Boston Globe, FAZ, The Nation, and CBC. Forbes named her the next billion champion and the right kind of person to reform tech. She's consulted for a number of organizations, including Adobe, UNHCR, GE, HP, and many others. She is a professor at Erasmus University Rotterdam and co-founder of FemLab, a feminist future of work initiative. Welcome, Payal. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. What an honor.
It's great. And also in the panel today is Viviane Fluck. Viviane is the coordinator for community engagement and accountability in Asia Pacific based in Manila. She supports more than 38 national societies in the Asia Pacific region, and she has been with the IFRC for the last few years, really helping to spearhead the opportunity to digitize community engagement. Welcome, Viviane.
Thank you. So great to be here with everybody.
So great to have you here. Thank you again. So now I'm going to turn over to Payal, who's going to open us up today and really talk about the future What does the future look like when it comes to digital communications, and what have we been missing in the way that we engage with people? Why do people want to engage with us? Why don't they want to engage with us? What are the stumbling blocks that they face to be able to let their voices be heard? So, Payal, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to turn off my screen, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. And thank you again, everyone, for making the time. And yeah, so I'm going to just get started with tight schedule. We have a very timely theme called personalization equals dignity. And I think this is something that is worth talking about as our everyday lives get digitized and platformized in many ways. And this includes social services and our well-being, right? So I think what really helps to first start off is this equation of personalization equals dignity. It's not a default outcome. It's tempting to believe that it would be a default outcome, that personalize it, which is basically you tailor it and you acknowledge the diversity of people and cultures and places. Thereby, it would result in a dignified livelihood, well-being, and lifestyle, right? But it demands a certain kind of social and technical guardrails for us to ensure that that equation actually is met. So it helps to actually go back into a bit of history of both the humanitarian field and the digitization field, particularly the term personalization, right? So if you think about the humanitarian field, I mean, it comes from a sort of post-colonial, legacy where, the way in which the global South, which was very flattened, reductivist, this notion of there is a developed country, the prototype Anglo-Saxon Western context where the developing countries can catch up, right? So this was for decades a sort of mentality, is a top-down, how do you become like us without actually acknowledging the responsibilities of coloniality. And then, of course, there was a shift in development studies, and many of you know, in humanitarian, where there was acknowledgement that a lot of major projects fail when you don't take into consideration people's unique cultures, livelihoods, their ways of beliefs and thinking and values, right? And so, there was a much more emphasis on the participatory angle, where you co-participate, you co-design programs and services to enable people to uplift themselves and have a better future. So the participatory angle, in some ways, one can argue, is a pathway to personalization, right? Because you are genuinely paying heed to the values of people by listening to them, putting them at the center, then you're able to come up with much more tailored programs. So this is a sort of where we're at. But also in recent years, there's a pushback saying, let's not put the burden on people to become participants, because people don't have the stamina, the bandwidth, particularly at the end of the long tail. And there needs to be a both top-down sort of infrastructural and, value change so as to enable this, as bottom down, right? So it's not either or. So this is where we are at. Interestingly, if you look at the digitization field, it's very similar, actually, in the way in which personalization is conceived. The first era of web of technologies was about the web 1.0. As you remember, like how you basically have websites, and it was very top down. It was about information dissemination, right? Very much like, okay, here we have all the information and you are the recipients. And then there was a shift to the web 2.0, which was about almost valorizing the wisdom of the crowds, right? Much like the early days of participatory programs where, everybody in the field knows what they want, but they don't quite, because they don't have the overview sometimes. They don't have the bandwidth. They don't have the sort of capacity building. So we over-romanticize it, much like the web 2.0. And as you've seen over the years, there's been a lot of disruptions. There's been, the crowds are not always, wise and worthy. They can actually be filled with hate speech, right-wing propaganda, and a variety of other values. And now we have the sort of Web 3.0, which is about user empowerment, data ownership, privacy preservation. And the idea is, how can we use advanced technologies in a way that can create tailored experiences and align it with individual preferences and consent? So these are actually trajectories which are well worth keeping in mind, the humanitarian digitization, because they're coming together. Because a lot of our, products and services in doing good industries are being platformized. Because if you want to, many of the, say, if you're looking at refugees, they are very much living their lives in many ways on WhatsApp and TikTok and trying to reach out, build solidarity, sociality, engage, rehumanize themselves, right? And so how do we think about, like I mentioned in the thing, if we want at the start, if we want to ensure personalization results in dignity, what kinds of social and technical guardrails are needed to ensure that the humanitarian digitization pathways merge in a way which ensures that we do have the outcomes we actually desire, right? So I'm just going to give you 3 quick projects that I've been involved with, and the ways in which they're doing so, which can sort of stimulate this discussion, is one is the project that just got wrapped up with UNHCR, which was about focusing on Venezuelan forced displaced populations in Brazil. And we were working with them, with the innovation services team, to look at how they are, self-actualizing, building dignity, particularly through digital tools and services. And we want to ensure that programs and services could be tailored based on their needs and, more importantly, their aspirations. Because people, of course, need things at this point in time, but they're aspirational beings. Okay. They have a vision for themselves of what they want to be. So this is equally important. And we actually basically hired influencers in the field to work with them to build content on what they'd like to be and train them to actually use TikTok and other kinds of media to profile themselves. And what was very interesting is that indeed digital leisure became a significant pathway, because in a way, if you think about leisure, it sounds very peripheral and trivial, but it's fundamental to majority of the populations of the world who are at the margins, because leisure is basically unstructured time and space, which enables you to play with the rules of the game and to sort of see where you'd like to be, right? And it gives you far more freedoms and bandwidth than perhaps your sort of current context. So we actually had a wonderful way in which we were able to see the different kinds of aspirations of these Venezuelan refugees by working with influencers, right? Another project is with which we just got wrapped up, is with IDRC project, which is a Canadian grant organization on how women workers at the bottom of the value chain in India and Bangladesh are basically using the gig economy to, boost their dignity through these sort of personalized technologies. And what's interesting is there's a deep gendered sort of lens which we need to really pay heed to, because there's a double marginalization going on. In the last few years, actually a decade, women have been leaving the workforce, which is contrary to development, agendas, particularly as the economic situation improves. So it's a sort of counterintuitive and deeply disturbing trend. And then you couple that with the digitization trend, where women are moving away from the internet because they don't see it as for them, because the spaces are not seen as safe and women friendly. And some of the learnings we found, for example, women in the ride-hailing sector, is that the technologies, as I mentioned, you need to have also the top-down approach. The platforms are not built for diverse populations. For instance, women taxi drivers said one of the main reasons why they dropped out of the workforce in the ride-hailing sector was that there was far few, places on the app which allowed them to see where the closest toilets, because they needed toilets and rest stations which were safe clean, and were welcoming, because it was very dominated by the male ride-hailing, workers. So this is just a small example of how platforms can, if they consider diverse populations, can understand the needs of their different populations, and particularly those who are the most vulnerable, so as to ensure that they remain included, right? And of course, there are multiple other examples. What's interesting also is that, as I mentioned, that personalization doesn't necessarily result in dignity, is that, for example, if you allow features of, say, caste, race, into a system, a digital system, where you can actually choose that as a criteria, it can amplify discrimination. For example, with the ride-hailing sector, or with the delivery sector in India, if you are able to talk about and get an option of which caste you want, who will deliver your food, or which religious group, that actually constitutes as discrimination. And so that is something very important, is how we design systems, the choices we give, and more importantly, not give, nudges people into understanding that these are not options, right? So, and the last project I'd like to bring up, which also gives us some sort of perspective on how we can make sure that digitized systems can lead to a more equitable outcomes, is a new project I'm working on, which is a Horizon European funded project on fairness in recruitment systems, particularly because they're becoming increasingly AI enabled. That's because when you have massive amounts of CVs coming in, the first layer is screened by algorithms, right? And this is impacting much of the systems across board, right? Including the humanitarian sector, where they're overwhelmed with the kinds of requests and information. So oftentimes, the first layers of bureaucracy is screened by AI. And that really is where we need to watch out for, because AI is basically algorithms which are trained on data sets. And if the data sets are biased, because it is basically a accumulation of the history of our data out there, which is deeply, racialized, sexually, biased, and a variety of other reasons, then the output will, of course, remain the same. We'll be reproducing history. So our project basically is to create new forms of data sets, which pays heed to the missing elements, which is a marginalized majority. So we are creating these artificial CVs from people of color and other marginalized groups, so we can populate the data sets and thereby shift the algorithm. So these are just, and this is what we are calling the synthetic data sets, right? This is a new trend of, that's the way in which you can shape the algorithmic systems, because not just the algorithm that can create bias, it's the data sets itself, right? So these are just 3 examples where, if we ensure we are being creative, we are thinking out of the box, paying heed to the groups that are the most vulnerable and systematically invisibilized over the decades, then we can ensure that personalization, which is in theory a good thing, because you're tailoring and listening to it, listening to diverse voices and giving weight to them and legitimation, that can result in dignified, outcomes and lifestyles and overall well-being. But it demands social and technical guardrails. So I will stop here, and I am really looking forward to this conversation. So I hope this has enough meat to get us going. Thank you.
It gives you a prompt. So people with the feature phones.
Thank you so much, Payal. That was wonderful. It's great to hear you speak, as always, and really informative. Maybe, Patricia, I'll turn it over to you and Secretary General Sandy in Nairobi to maybe go ahead and give us your first comments or thoughts on Payal's presentation.
All right. Thank you so much for that presentation. I will say a few words on the thing she mentioned about participation, and that is a very, very critical part of having
operate
the
with
communities
any
we deal
device
with. Like
in any
in our
context
situation,
very easily.
when we work with
Work
communities,
on a tablet,
especially
can work on a,
trying to use
on a laptop.
digital approaches, trying to use communication,
that is
for
the
example,
one
as aid. Now, no matter how excellent the strategies are, no matter how excellent the platforms are, if it does not create space for participation of the communities, of the people you're serving, of the people that are affected, you miss out a lot, and there's a chance they will outrightly reject the support, the aid you provide. So it's a very critical part in ensuring people receive help in a dignified way. If they are not giving a chance to participate, whether it's in the development or the implementation phases of the interventions, we run a risk of missing out and sometimes even outright rejection.
Thank you very much. Now, I can't help myself by then asking you a question. A few weeks ago, I was in Zambia, where we implemented a project on food security and livelihoods. We went to visit the communities, and when asking them what can we do to help you, the only thing they were saying, we're missing water, lack of water. Now, my question to both of you would be, what is really the future of digital services for people in disadvantaged communities?
Okay, so firstly, I want to approach this from the idea of communication as aid and connectivity as aid. Now, this is a concept of communication as aid, the use of information, communication tools and strategies to help people in crises, in disasters, or other emergencies. And connectivity as aid is using internet connectivity or the connection technologies to, whether by Wi-Fi hotspots, mobile devices, or satellite phones, to help people going through crises, disasters, and aid. Now, the question, before I get to your question specifically, the question is, does communication as aid and connectivity as aid, does it really empower communities or does it disempower them? Does it leave them dignified or not? It depends largely on how we implement these interventions. Communication as aid or connectivity as aid can significantly empower communities with information, with resources, opportunities, and also give them a chance to make their voices heard. And it also provides them the information they need to make important decisions that relate to their safety, their health, and their well-being. And I mentioned earlier participation. It also creates the space for effective community engagement and participation. So if we implement such approaches and we go into communities to support them, and we do not pay attention to these facts, we miss out a lot, and we leave vulnerable communities more disempowered. For example, if we start a new approach with a technology that is not accessible to everyone, or that is not familiar to a number of people, it results in digital divide. A number of people are left out, and it also creates the possibility for the few people who have access to the technology or who have the know-how to exploit those people who are already very, very vulnerable. And also, if these interventions do not pay attention to the cultural sensitivities or context-specific issues that come up when we have those disasters, crises, or other emergencies, there's a chance that people may completely reject them. And there's a chance also that the vulnerable people we go in to help are left in a more desperate situation than we met them in the first place. So it's always good to pay attention to these details, because there's a chance what we go in to do might just fail completely or be outrightly rejected because we do not think about all of these sensitivities.
Thank you so much. Chris, did you have maybe another question?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Secretary General Sandy. And just to dive into that and maybe turn it over to Viviane here in a second, but one of the things that's popping out for me between what you're saying and what Payal has said is this idea that, the understanding that digital is not the panacea, right? It cannot reach everybody. There are communities that aren't going to be able to be reached. And that turns it over to kind of Viviane to talk about what are we doing? How are we mixing the mix of digital and face-to-face, right? Do we use a percentage of saying we want to reach this amount of people as best we can digitally and this amount of people the best that we can in our traditional face-to-face work? Are there other considerations, maybe Payal, from your perspective that you found in your research that helps to formulate these types of engagements? But maybe over to you, Viviane, if you've got a question, and then maybe Payal, just to kind of talk about what your research has brought about on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think some really, really interesting points already of everybody that I completely agree with. So the biases that we see in the offline world definitely translate into the online world very easily. And we see that when we come up with the technical or digital solutions in isolation, that they just simply don't work, but also that they have the same issues that any kind of solution might have that is developed in isolation. And then we have a solution and go around and ask, oh, do you have a problem that's fitting my solution? And that's not how things should be done, obviously. I'm thinking of Afghanistan, for instance, where after the Taliban came, it was recommended to switch to messenger services that were better encrypted, but simply by having a messenger service like this on your phone, you looked suspicious that you were trying to hide something. And so the solution that was kind of thrown at people from outside the country was actually not really working in the reality of people's lives. And so what we try to do is, rather than reaching certain percentages, really make sure that we actually troubleshoot together with communities rather than coming up with solutions by ourselves. And I think what Payal was saying about participation is really important, that, some people say, oh, we don't want to overburden people. And so what we always try to remind ourselves of and what we aim for is that the burden of effort is on the humanitarian side, and that we're really more acting as the support staff of communities. And when I say communities, obviously I mean diverse communities, because within one community there are so many different groups, and they all have different preferences. But I think personalization, to me, it's not just about tailoring something and understanding what do people like, but really coming up with something together. So creating these solutions together, bringing the questions into the community, troubleshooting together, and then coming up with something. And a nice example was, I think, in Mongolia, where several movement partners are working together on digital community engagement and accountability, and are starting with first understanding what is actually the context of different groups within this community that we're trying to support. And then very slowly building something on that. But of course, that also takes time and investment that very often either we're not willing to give or we cannot give.
Yeah, thanks, Viviane. And over to you, Payal, for your thoughts, especially on who are we trying to engage with? What's our general baseline that we know that we're going to be able to engage with people, and the baseline of people that we're not really going to be able to engage with?
Yeah, I mean, so one of some really good points have been made, like just tapping first with the points of Secretary General Sandy, is about access. Indeed, access continues and remains an issue, even though, of course, there's been major strides, right? In the last few years, particular data has become extraordinarily cheap in many parts of the world, including India and China, but that's not representative of still much of the global south. So that long tail still remains. And particularly in context, for example, in refugee settlements where access is not a right, and it should be, right? I mean, so there's still a need to approach this as a business model for sustainability, but it has a flawed angle, because it is a very essential starting point upon which businesses are being developed and social services are being delivered. So it has to be implemented as a right. It cannot be a business model in itself. Because, I mean, we are at a stage in life where across sectors, in particular the pandemic reminded us that much of, like, whether it's public education, healthcare, or what is considered essential human rights services are being platformized, right? And this became even more so obvious during the pandemic. And so I would say that access, the argument of access as a right is in practice not being delivered, and it needs to be as a starting point, which shockingly still is a debate, right? So I think that's one. The other is a disturbing trend is about, access in terms of during the pandemic, it seems like we've had a shift to much more of a inward lookingness. Like, I think it's also the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created even more of a fear of let's double down, let's create a sort of a fortress mentality, which actually goes against the sort of universal rights approach, because especially in the digitized field, it's about to each his own, basically you have this data localization policies where governments are saying, we are going to keep our data to ourselves. And so each nation, in the name of sovereignty, is able to be much more intrusive, and it can be very protective. But the problem is a lot of marginalized populations are more vulnerable in that regard. So as I mentioned, like personalization, for it to become dignified, we have to ensure and invest a lot into the safety and security of data, particularly because every mundane act of communication of populations at risk becomes high risk by default, because it's all about the context within which it operates. So it could, and I think Viviane's example is really good, is that even the signal of being able to put certain kinds of apps can, put people into deep, trouble. And I was just thinking about, the gender angle, as Viviane was talking about, is that, for example, we have these normative understandings that, if we have, if women are given access to technologies, then they must do well. They will be able to lift themselves out of poverty. But actually, women actually find it to be, in many ways, a hindrance to get a mobile phone, because their husbands put tracking technologies on it. That means they have even less freedoms when they move around, because their husband now knows exactly where they're going, where they're stopping at. So it is extraordinarily intrusive. So it is not surprising why women are moving away from mobile phones and, digital spaces, because it actually does a disservice to them in terms of the way in which they can exercise their agency in, subtle ways. So the other thing is about how we feel like, well, marginalized populations need to be visible and gain a voice, right, and be heard and seen. Again, not if you look at the gendered angle, it's not necessarily the case. The more visible they are, they can actually be a target for increasing misogyny. So a lot of vulnerable groups need proxies. It could be in the form of, animation, avatars, voice apps, instead. So one has to think creatively about what representation means, because we're so visual oriented, we're so identity centric in a way which can put many of these vulnerable populations, at heat. So all I'm saying is that, when we start to listen to these people's experiences, we realize what we think is a good solution is not necessarily good, depending on which populations are we targeting. So we have to definitely understand why do they do what they do? Why are they moving away from certain apps? Why do they not feel this is conducive to their well-being? And in that sense, we have to think out of the box to ensure that we get them included, and yet it should be protective enough where they can have the choice of being to opting out if need be, for their own safety and security,
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And Secretary General Stanley, just to maybe point to you a little bit on some of your comments, the communication is aid kind of mentality. At the IFRC, we've been working together with a number of national societies on what we call digital engagement hubs, which are the opportunity to engage with people over their mobile phones through WhatsApp, but also through SMS and through phone calls, et cetera. So trying to find those right channels that work for each one of the populations. But as you've seen in your national society, what are some of the stumbling blocks that you've come up against when it comes to digitally engaging with the people that you're trying to serve? I mean, you mentioned kind of some generalities, but is there a specific example that you can give us on how something has been difficult or something has been really positive in your national society around engaging digitally with communities?
Well, I think one of the major challenges is on how to ensure that these solutions are also culturally sensitive, and they take into cognizance the values and the norms of the societies. Now we have tried using approaches like WhatsApp and other apps to bring our volunteers together, to bring youth together. We find that the ability for our youth and our volunteers to engage is significantly enhanced. They feel empowered when you give them those platforms. However, you're leaving out a number of them, and a number of them feel it is not, those spaces are not the right the places where the work of the Red Cross or the things we do should be communicated for several reasons. And when we come to situations of response, when we respond to disasters and to emergencies, we also find that there are times the availability of those platforms cannot be guaranteed. Sometimes suddenly they go off, and especially in places where power cuts are very frequent and the platforms are controlled by government or other authorities, it's very difficult to ensure that to get those ones to be very sustainable. So those are some huge challenges that we have had to face. We sometimes start new initiatives. They seem to work very well, but then we get the challenge of leaving out majority of the youth, because then you think about the underlying challenges like the economy and people not having access to those things, people not even being sure of the security of those platforms. So there are many, many issues that we've been trying to overcome when we implement new solutions in the national society, and those are a few I've mentioned.
Thanks so much. And Payal, just on one of your comments that you made as you were giving your talk, was this issue of burden. And you know, when we talk about burden, we can also talk about empowering and disempowering. But what is the burden? A mental burden? Is the burden a monetary burden? You know, can you unpack that a little bit for us so we can understand better what burden people feel or physically have to deal with when they're engaging digitally?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we now have, you know, decades of experience on how many participatory programs fail in the humanitarian sector. And we've learned from one thing is just because you involve them by putting them in a room, it doesn't happen. The magic doesn't happen. One is they are so primed to speak humanitarian, you know, buzzwords, and, you know, they're able to feed the beast, shall we say, in order, because they believe that that's the only way they can get social services. So you may not get authentic insights unless you try to be creative in the way in which you can, you know, build sincere spaces. So you need to be able to get intermediaries that have legitimacy, and not, you know, oneself flying into the site and like saying, okay, let's scout out how great are our programs, right? Let me hear from you. So there is this thing that, you know, there's a burden of them needing to decipher the politics of what they need to say in order to get their, you know, essential services. And we basically, the losing end is both parties, right? So you don't get authentic data, and they believe that they're not actually got a choice because they have to play that game. So one has to be imaginative, and also and humble, more importantly, by saying that, well, you're not going to get that unless you think out of the box, which means identify, and usually it takes much more pain, right? It takes effort to look for the legitimate intermediaries that can speak across, different marginalized groups, because we can't also assume that these groups are necessary in concert with one another. There may be tensions internally, right? As we know with, say, the refugee settlements, where different groups have their own agendas and they're not on the same page, right? So that itself requires a lot of effort. Then you need monetary resources, because people are not, they don't have the stamina and the bandwidth to keep volunteering, because there's a legacy of extraction, because what we're doing is constant, whether it was surveys of the past, it's a constant data extraction. It feels like a sort of a one-way street. So we have to understand that participation is labor. And it is, in a sort of a feminist way, that labor has value and it also has monetary value. So recognize that is a job, right? So these are very boring but essential ways in which we can make it rigorous at the ground level. And, for example, with even this creating synthetic data sets, by asking for voluntary contributions of CVs from people of color. Just because you put it on Twitter doesn't mean like there'll be all the people who will submit it, because they're not on Twitter. So do we have, when we design projects, a decent budget to be able to recruit CVs? By how would you do it? You need to go into the communities that are more marginalized. You need to talk to people, explain to them. It has to be more offline effort for us to change the digital, being. But the problem is that it doesn't sound sexy enough, right? Because we're so enamored by the latest of AI and generative media, et cetera. You're like, well, all we do is put everything out there, everyone's online, and actually that's not the case. It requires a lot of physical, social laboring for us to ensure that the digital system is, oriented in the right direction. So these are just some examples, but it goes into, again, a lot of boringness. Do we have a sufficient creative approach to it? Do we have a budget that is particularly focused on these intermediaries, which tend not to, versus putting the money in the technology itself? Most often than not, it's not the latest technologies that are at play. For example, financial inclusion. People were so enamored by crypto, etc. No, it is basic WhatsApp payments, or it's these PayPal and other sort of very, very basic services which have been around for a while and will continue to be around. And I think we need to look at old technologies that's very much here for a long time to come, and they are being renewed in the way in which people use it. Right? And there's a reason why they persist, because they're simple, they're accessible, they require low data. So that means they are able to be used across different borders. So we tend to not do that, because we are all like trying to jump on the bandwagon of novel. The more novel it is, then surely we assume that the better an output will be, which obviously is false. So, stop there.
No, that's spectacular. And Viv, I want to ask you a question around this idea of recognizing the labor, recognizing the monetary value of engagement. And I think that there's a couple of special pieces here. I know over the digital engagement hubs, we're able to transfer credit back to people. So when they answer the survey, we transfer that mobile credit back to them that they've used. We can operate with our to make sure that people that engage the system get access to certain such programming. But from your side, what are some of those, what I think Payal called them gentle nudges? What are these nudges that we can give that increase participation or potentially increase participation over digital means? Because I think that we all can say that to reach people at scale, face-to-face, is not very easy, right? It's very difficult. It takes a lot of work, a lot of time and effort, especially in crisis situations. So digital gives us this enabling factor, right? To reach a population quickly while we're engaging with that other vulnerable population that might not be participating digitally face to face. But from your side, what's some of your experiences that you've had in the field with these gentle nudges that have worked potentially to help others?
I would start by saying that probably we're the ones who need the gentle nudges, or maybe not so gentle nudges, to make participation work rather than the community. Because I really think, again, the effort should be on our side. And that's what's making participation hard, that we're coming with an idea and then we expect others to be on board with it and be excited. And that we've brought something, a really great solution. Look at this new digital thing that will help you, without actually realizing that people have a life and have a lot of other things to deal with that are very serious, and that this might not be a priority. And so I think rather than nudging them towards something that might not fit them, but that is kind of our idea and our solution, I would rather nudge us to actually first ask a question and ask, okay, so what do you actually want to do? And trying to find a way that is not an extra burden where we're going into what Payal was describing as extracting more data, because I do think there is definitely a fatigue of humanitarians coming and asking a lot of questions and then not even sharing the results of those questions. Like very often we do surveys, we don't go back, we don't communicate those results back to the community, whereas they're very interested in that. And so I think you have to take time to build that relationship. You have to keep on going back and keep on listening. It's not just a one-time information extraction exercise, but it's about really becoming partners. And that way you will also learn, okay, what is it that people actually find useful, so that they get something of value out of it. And sometimes that could be monetary, but it could also be something else. Maybe it makes a certain piece of work for them much easier, or perhaps it links them to a service that they always wanted but couldn't quite reach. And so I think that is how we nudge ourselves to actually facilitate better participation opportunities in a way.
Thanks, Viviane. Thanks so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Patricia in Nairobi in just a second. But I did want to remind everybody that in about 10 minutes, we're going to open up for Q&A for everyone. So please be writing down your questions and be ready to ask. And like I said, our colleagues on YouTube that are watching the streaming version can be able to do that, but also our colleagues face-to-face in Nairobi will be able to ask questions, and it'll be facilitated by Patricia while she's there. But Patricia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now, maybe I have a question for you, Secretary General Sandy. How concretely on the field, how can we democratize access to connectivity and to digital solutions concretely, and to be able to reach marginalized communities as well?
Well, that is a very, very good question. Concretely on the field, how do we ensure we democratize digital approaches? It's a difficult thing to do, because firstly, we have to ensure that if we're talking about the national society, for example, do we know how many people in the national society, firstly, have access to the particular digital solution we're providing? And it begins with data. So firstly, ensuring we have data on what works and what doesn't, and which platforms our people are on and which ones they are not on, and finding what to do to bring them to those platforms that we want to provide as a solution. So we have, in our national society, we have been trying to ensure that all our volunteers are on two major platforms, like WhatsApp and Facebook. It's been a difficult drive, but we've started with data from the branches. How many, for example, youth are on our groups, and how many of them are participating actively in conversation? So firstly, how do we ensure that there is constant engagement? Because you can have those solutions that do not fix anything. They're just there for the convenience of having a solution. So are we solving any problem? Are we thinking of a solution for problems within the national society? Are we trying to address challenges? Are we trying to provide support for communities? So firstly, having the leadership that will drive that digital solution, I think is the beginning of democratization. And then within a national society, we already have an established structure, breaking it down to those structures and seeing how each of those structures can have a role in ensuring that these solutions are rolled out and are effective and people are fully engaged at all levels. And that's where the challenge is, and that's how I think we've been doing it at our national society.
Thank you very much. Now I'm hearing data, and I would like to turn to Payal and ask her, what are the risks associated to using synthetic data? I think, Payal, you've mentioned it quite a few times, but what are the risks now?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. So actually, just before I answer that, I just want to echo and build on Viviane's point. I think, indeed, we can go beyond monetary value. And I think a number of things which we could do is offer upskilling workshops, literacy workshops on particular kinds of tools and services. That itself, like, for example, the UNHCR, we hired an influencer that helped them to understand how to game the metrics, become more visible. So something, because when we were working with a number of NGOs in the field, they complained that, well, what's in it for us, right? And exactly what you were saying, Viviane. So anyway, so I just want to, and also in terms of nudges, it's also a very sexy term, but we have to ensure that when we talk about nudges, there are positive nudges and negative nudges, and we have to gear towards the positive nudges, where we're trying to induce people to orient them towards their positive social behaviors. So going into your question, Patricia, about the data, is the problem with synthetic data is that so for example, this Project Finder, right, this Horizon Europe grant, which probably was the biggest USP was that we are promising that we're going to create a new data set which is much more equitable, because if we have a better data set, it will shift the algorithm. So we're going to the roots of the problem. The problem is, how do you build something like that? So that means you have to not only recruit these CV donations, right, from people of color, which is an effort, and also we are assuming that they need CVs to apply for their positions, which is not necessarily the case. Now it's very audiovisual, for instance, right? So it's already one assumption, and the future of work is changing quite dramatically. So that's one. We are very textual oriented and biased, whereas audiovisual is a whole different ball game, because AI is not there yet at all. Actually, it is more like guesswork in terms of sentiment analysis. Like you could get a 50%, either right or wrong. So that's one. The other is to be able to understand how we, what does equity mean? Like in terms of, if you want to assess the impact, you have to identify who is donating these CVs. And by the way, this can be transferable to any kind of data that you're trying to create for the humanitarian background, right? So you're saying, okay, I want to target these populations who are constantly chronically targeted. So I want to ensure that their data is well represented in terms of their voices, etc. The problem is when you get something high sensitive like that, GDPR kicks in, or other kinds of privacy laws, which means that as an implementer of synthetic data, you're not actually allowed to force them to disclose who they're at. So that means I can't track where these CVs are coming from, which means that I can't actually assess impact. So, it's sort of a bizarre situation where the laws that are geared to protecting you are not necessarily allowing you to be innovative in ways that can change the system. So it's a really confounding problem. And so then you have to have an assumption that, well, I'm going to create the synthetic data based on this guesswork that this is coming from, these marginalized communities, because they don't need to disclose that. And then the last layer is, of course, identifying what are the elements of discrimination, because you have to get rid of those elements and also repurpose it. But the question is, what are proxies of discrimination? And that's a whole different ballgame. I mean, the easy one is gender and, race, but there's other kinds, because particularly socioeconomic, or, there's certain phrases that can be used, or the way in which accents, for example, in audiovisual. And that opens a can of worms, and we're so at the early stages of proxy data because our cultures are living and breathing and moving. And so it's very dynamic, the kind of terminology we use, the language we use, and what that signifies can shape the way we are biased or unbiased, right? So anyway, so these are the challenges. Obviously, I'm just touching upon it and maybe getting a bit too technical, but this is the reality, is that people are very enthusiastic about it, particularly from the private sector, because finally they can sleep, but actually then you can't account for it. This whole idea of transparency in AI doesn't quite work then. So you can see the conundrum here.
You're not getting too technical. What you're getting into is really the complexity of using digital engagement, especially with the advent of AI and diving more deeply into that. First, I want to turn to the crowd that's in Nairobi, while our colleagues on YouTube are engaging with some questions, and just ask you a question as the folks that are sitting in the plenary. As we move to the future in your national society or from the IFRC, what are you seeing? What are you feeling? Do you have the same experiences as Secretary General Sandy, that it's a balance that you're having to strike? Or are you in a place where digital tools aren't being used and you're tracking a different way? Or are you in a national society where digital tools are at the forefront of what you're doing and you're tracking in that direction? And so over to the crowd, and Patricia, please feel free to coordinate on that side. But I wanted to pose that to just get this Q&A session started. A question to you as the crowd, and then we hopefully will take some from the YouTube folks and et cetera after that. But Patricia?
Thank you very much, Chris. Would anyone want to answer? Or comment? Yes. Can somebody maybe get you the mic? We have a hand raised. Perfect. It's right there. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Geida. I believe in technology and innovation, and I think as IFRC, Red Cross, and all other national societies, if we build our solutions humanitarian basis, but with the use of technology, and it's going to gear us more years of future, technology is going to advance. In Kenya, we talk of Vision 2030 that is geared into technology in solving problems. So basing and integrating the humanitarian work that FRC does and Kenya Red Cross national societies, I think it's going to be a good approach. And through innovation that the youth and hubs in Kenya Red Cross are doing, I believe we're in the right direction.
Yada, can I ask you another question? Don't put down the microphone. Let me ask you. So from your perspective, from who you are, what do you feel and your friends and the people around you about engaging with technology? What are some of the things that you're finding to be really innovative in how you are engaged as a youth in Kenya?
I can say it's a very good approach. I'm doing my bachelor's in information technology, which is IT, and I believe through the coding clubs that we have at our branch in Mombasa, and through the various engagements in IoT, Internet of Things programs, the coding programs, I believe it sets our minds into solving the humanitarian problems and using technology. So I believe I, as a beneficiary of those programs and many programs that are being geared by the society, it's going to do so many things, and we're going to do great, and more innovations in technology aspects are going to be brought up. So I think it's a very good approach, and I really wish other societies could borrow that from us. And you never know, in future it might be the best option for all of us.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can keep the mic because I have a question for you as well. Do you feel that there is a gender gap in digital communication and access space?
I can say before we had those issues where girls were not given so much opportunity when it comes to technology and innovation. But of late, I can say we're both engaged. The gender is quite okay. We have both boys and girls taking up STEM courses. I am one of them. I'm doing a STEM course. And I believe the opportunities are adverse for both genders. And through the programs that we're being given at the Hub and at the Red Cross, I think we are on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question or a comment from online, Chris from YouTube. He's wondering how leadership or youth like him and senior leaders can have more tech and data-friendly leadership. And also if we can achieve this, how can it drive transformation in our network? Would anyone want to answer that?
But I just want to point out, Patricia, as well, there was another question which was the same one about it, but from a completely different commenter. So this big question about digital leadership and how do we have digitally mature leadership within our national societies and in the work that we do. I think it's a big question. And so maybe I turn it over, maybe I know that Yurian Lar, I want to put him on the spot. I think he's sitting there at the front table. Yurian, from the Red Cross perspective, what are we doing on digital maturity of the national societies themselves, and what approaches are we taking right now?
Thank you, Chris. It's always good to put me on the spot. We'll talk about that later. No, I think, the question, of course, is about leadership by national societies, and for that we are offering tools to help national societies understand where they are in 3 axes: people, process, and technology. And I think one of the key important factors is the people. Because the technology is one thing. And hearing this conversation, I think it's also about not just the people and their readiness too, but it's also how digital mature people are themselves. How much do they know about? How can you actually apply? What do you not cover? What will you cover? And in particular, where do you need still to work offline and where you can intensify online? And I think that is a balance that is really a complex one. And that does require much more onboarding of people into our staff base, in our volunteer base, that are really much more skilled in the digital domain. So more investment is certainly needed, and I think that is also why these events take place. And we want to really raise the bar when it comes to digital and then our understanding of the opportunities and the risks.
Thank you very much, Yurian. We have another question from a line again. How personalization digital data in communication as aid? That was quite clear, but how personalization?
Yeah, Patricia, let me unpack that a little bit. I think the question is really about by personalizing engagement, how does that offer new services to people, right? So the more PII, personally identifiable information, we're able to gather over our digital systems, how does that help us help them better? And so what I've seen and what we've seen over the last year at the IFRC is that the greater we understand what each household needs, the greater we're able to answer the question of each individual household. It gives us that opportunity to really be able to give them the service that they require. So many times, we look at how we respond in emergencies. We load up a couple land cruisers, we send people out to the field, we conduct a few assessments, we come back, we write a proposal, then we get funds, and then we go forward and provide a service. But this idea of digital engagement flips that on its head, because this then can potentially mean that people that are in need are reaching out to us, coming to us and saying, look, this is the service that I need, this is the help that I need, and this is what I need you to give me. This is the exact assistance that I need. I have 3 children that have these needs. I'm a female-headed household. I've got security risks, etc. And so it helps us to redefine our assistance package so that it can really be delivered one-to-one versus one-to-many. Now, that doesn't work in everything, right? We know that. But as we move into this cash space, as we move into the future of delivering digital cash for people throughout the world, our need to understand each individual household and their needs to be able to design that cash package in a way that is fit for purpose for them is going to be really important. And as we said, digital tools aren't the panacea. It's not going to reach the whole population that we're trying to serve, but it's going to enable us to help a larger part of the population one-to-one so that we can really concentrate our field staff and the people that are volunteers in the field on those vulnerable communities that can't reach out over digital means. So it provides a balance, an enablement, so to say, on what we're doing. But Patricia, I'll turn it over to you. I'm sure there's a ton of questions coming from the crowd right now. I can feel their hands are just burning to be raised. So Patricia, I think I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from up front here. Actually, we have two, but we'll start with you.
Thank you so much. I'm Emil from Danish Red Cross, and thank you very much for an interesting presentation and discussion so far. I'll try and see if I can frame my question, because I think there are a few sort of, not contradictions, but in this debate, and I think one of them is, how do we actually scale contextualization? And I think my question to the panel is also, how do we, as a Red Cross movement, how much should we build these digital tools ourselves, and how much should we open up also to the big tech? I mean, we've mentioned WhatsApp a few times now. It's a good opportunity for us as a movement and as a humanitarian actor to latch onto this technology, but what are the pros and cons of that, and what is the sort of strengths and weaknesses, and at least the questions that we should ask ourselves in terms of doing so? Thank you.
I don't want to take another question, but I will real quick, because I'm just so deep into this on this specific one around technology. So the approach that we've taken is around using big tech as an enabler with us to be able to design bespoke communications. So we engage with WhatsApp as the IFRC. We engage with Twilio, which is a platform that we use on communications at the IFRC. And what we're doing with them is having them bring their expertise into us and to help us use their tools in the best way possible. So really using a business approach, how businesses and commercial organizations engage with people, trying to adapt that into the humanitarian sector and to see how best we can utilize those same solutions for them. So we do the dev, we don't develop it internally. We use outsourced development to build the tools that we do. But at the same time, we use those tech firms to give us the tools that we need to do it. But Payal, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, because so there's a number of good questions here, and I think it would help by emphasizing that personalization does not mean individualization, because there's this tendency to believe it is, then it appears like a formidable task because of scalability issues. What personalization emphasizes is that there are clusters of groups. I mean, that's also how the data spaces work, right? It's not like targeting a person, it's targeting a type of people, right? Because you're oftentimes clustered at that type of person and that kind of group, and thereby services and products are designed for those people and groups. So I think that could be helpful in terms of scalability, but also we have to see the patterns of solidarities, because if we look at digital campaigns out there, a lot of why does something go viral? When it seems like, for example, Black Lives Matter, it went viral in Korea, where there are not many Black people out there. And that's because there is what goes viral is a very experiences beyond the sort of, identity politics of people's, relationship with authority, their security. So these are extraordinarily scalable. And this sort of, if we keep that in mind, actually there's a lot of potential of making this very feasible. But going to the WhatsApp element is that absolutely that there is a big fear about being held by, basically a hostage by private companies, as you've seen in the case of Australia, where Facebook, decided when there's a new regulation where they need to share and compensate, content creators in the journalism space, that Facebook said, well, and Meta, that is, said, well, we're going to leave, right? And this keeps happening. I mean, this is happening, I think, in Canada. And so anyway, and this kind of threat says, well, you know what, we're going to shut shop. And that means a lot of the public services developed on it is inaccessible overnight. So what's happening right now is this idea that if you have a monopoly, you're no longer technically a private company per se. You're actually a public space in many ways, a digital public space, because it's much like the railways, right? There's this public-private relationship, and this is the direction a lot of governance models are going in. It's saying, okay, you have a 92% monopoly like Google or 96% in certain countries. You're no longer just a company. You are an infrastructure. When you're an infrastructure, you're an utility, essential utility, which means you need to adhere to certain kinds of governance from the public. And this is not an option to hold entire citizens, hostage, right? So in which case we can use WhatsApp, but we have to ensure that there's a global consortium of leaders that keeps the end of the bargain of pushing these companies to toe the line. Because the reality is we've gone through over the decades a lot of state-driven initiatives, like France have tried their own Google, it's not feasible. It's not sustainable. And the reality is people don't just move digital homes. Once they set shop and say WhatsApp, it is a networked effect, unfortunately. But that's the reality. And again, it's about trade-offs. So people do build their services, and we should go where they're at while we're trying to reform and create choices. So it has to happen in tandem, right? So yeah, I think that's really, and then the last point on that is that just a question about the leadership. I think what I would like to emphasize, if you want to build good leadership using digital, like using the digital space and data, is that you have to understand that it starts with the social element. So for example, you can't just build a campaign purely online. It helps to have a sort of a social program. Like it needs to be imaginative. It needs to have rootedness for it to be meaningful. And digital is about, amplification, but it cannot be the starting and ending of it, right? So there needs to be a reverberation back into the everyday lives of people for it to be meaningful. So I think, it could be as simple as like I'm just thinking about the UNHCR projects where we hired the influencer to understand what people would like to be, like what kind of influencer would they like to be. And a number of refugees, some came up with eyebrow tutorials. They came up with this niche, right? Because they felt like that's my USP. But within that space, they were able to talk and share information about fintech and, about other dialogues about how do you optimize phone plans and other kind of learnings. But these are sort of innocuous spaces where a lot of sort of social sharing across different sectors happen, healthcare, etc. Or like somebody was decided to be an influencer by sharing all the health issues she had after hysterectomy, and in a very vivid detail. But also she felt that creates a sort of solidarity, and it also gave insights on healthcare services of what's missing, what's not. But this was meant to be, out there as content for people to relate to. So these are great ways, as starting points to understand, okay, I'm pretty sure many groups around the world would resonate with this, because that's the beauty of digitization, is it pervades across borders. And we understand then that that's what can be scalable. So yeah, so I see these as a lot of potential ways in which we can approach it, right?
Thank you very much, Payal. Before turning on to the next question, Emil, I would like to invite you on Wednesday. There is a session that Jirian will be hosting where he will explore what it takes really to scale a product or services in the global network. I think we had a second question.
I think my question was already answered. It was also about how do we balance scalability with some, with like genuine participation of communities. Yeah, because sometimes when we focus heavily on one community, when we focus our time and resources in this community, there is like hundreds or thousands of communities that are left behind. So yeah, how do we develop solutions that are of course, culturally sensitive and also locally adequate, but also that can be, used in multiple contexts.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe Secretary General Sandy, would you like to answer that one?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think about certain responses we have had and tried to provide solutions for them. For example, we had when we had the Ebola outbreak, and we had to. It was difficult to get communities to understand that our traditions, we could no longer go by them. I mean, we had to wash our dead bodies, we had to bury them ourselves. How do you communicate to them in a way that they'll understand? So we tried having television programs, radio programs to engage communities. But then what worked for communities like Freetown, that will be getting the television and radio programs, will not work for remote communities. So we developed the idea of having a radio in a box. We'll go to a certain community, set up a radio, and reach out to them, and not just reach out to them ourselves, engage their own leaders, give them the message so they pass it. So it's a very important consideration. What works in one context may not apply to another context, and even things like the language you use may not be applicable from one region to another, and even the messengers who is passing the message. One challenge we had with the same Ebola response was we going into communities with all our experience and knowledge and telling people, and people felt when they had fever or whatever it was, they would go to traditional healers. So our approach was, if we're going to be effective in this one, this message has to be passed by the traditional healer. So we had to recruit them, give them the message, empower them, give them the tools that they could use to reach whole communities. So yes, the digital solutions we provide may work for one community, and it's good that we try to scale it to other communities, but we have to consider localizing them, the context, the language, the cultures, and everything that will help it succeed in other communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have one last question from YouTube. Does communication as aid empower or disempower vulnerable people?
Well, it depends. It depends on a number of things. Firstly, like I mentioned, it does empower people when it provides them information, resources, opportunities, and it gives them all the information they require to make decisions on their own safety, their health, their well-being. But also when it creates the opportunity for communities to be meaningfully engaged, to have their own priorities factored into the design and implementation of interventions. And also when we ensure that through all of those engagements, whatever we do is implemented in a way that we promote equality, inclusion, and accessibility. I think it will definitely empower the communities. But yes, it's also possible to disempower them, because if you, like I mentioned, if you bring a solution, a digital solution that is not accessible or that is not used by everybody, the people who are left out may feel disempowered by it. And sometimes also, if we have solutions and communities are not engaged, it does not take into cognizance their cultures, their values, their norms, it runs the risk of failing and disempowering the people we set out to empower. So every time we provide the people through these solutions with the information, the tools, the resources they need to make the decisions themselves, to take ownership of it, then there's a chance we empower them, and there's also room for sustainability with those initiatives.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Viviane. I would like you to answer the same question. What are your opinion on this?
Sure, yes. I think, it depends on how we're using all of these tools, on what impact they have, right? I mean, not to get too academic or philosophical in the very limited time that we have, but I think the notion of giving power to somebody is in itself already, a something that we need to probably unpack and think about more, especially as humanitarians, because of course people have power already. And so when we go to the community engagement and communication as aid, which was always one of the key pillars of that, I think it has the potential to go both ways, right? So it can very much disempower people, it can discourage them, it can cause harm if it is done without people. But if we manage to actually do it with the people that we're trying to support, then it has the opportunity to to benefit, hopefully, and to support. Just to jump on the previous question as well, in terms of how can we kind of balance the scaling of digital. I think it's very much what the SG was saying of keeping a very localized approach that looks into what people actually want to be doing, what they are suggesting. And so I do think the best way is to combine the offline and the online. I'm thinking of, for instance, Nepal. The Nepal Red Cross during the pandemic came up with a digital volunteer program where the volunteers could actually still meet in person or had better online access sometimes. So they would have webinars for these volunteers on topics that they had heard from communities, and then they could talk to their neighbors and their family and kind of share information that was relevant to communities. So having that kind of mixed method approach, I think, is something that will kind of enable us to scale without only looking into one specific group, but hopefully being a little bit more diverse in our approach.
Thanks, Viv. And friends, as we come to a close, we've got just a few more minutes left. I did want to turn to the panel and offer some closing thoughts to you. So maybe we'll start with you, Payal. Just following this conversation, is there something you want to leave us all with, something to remember that'll stick in our heads as we go to the next session?
So yes, so just to carry that dialogue forward, I think perhaps it would really be helpful as we think about including populations and groups that have been long, invisible, is that particularly as we enter the digital realm and entrench ourselves, is that non-users or limited users are very much still part of the fabric of the digital infrastructures and data processes, because by default, right? So we have to understand that just because you are at the end and you don't have access to a mobile phone or you're not on certain platforms doesn't mean you don't exist online and you're not out there. You're very much there. And the important part is the way in which they're included. For example, it could be through old media, like in a case of Namibia, where people were using newspaper clippings and clicking a photograph of that and then sharing and reading it to their community in the village in Namibia. And so one mobile phone was, circulated across and the news spread, right? So there's a very, so we have to understand that even if you're a non-user, you're very much part of the digital fabric, which means that how do we incorporate programs and policies where non-users are basically the majority. We have to understand, because in the humanitarian context, all limited users or peripheral users, intermittent users, and that basically becomes the majority of types of users, right? And so if we can think in those terms, we will by default come up with flexible, vibrant projects and policies that will include people,
Thanks so much, Payal. And Viviane, some closing remarks from you as well?
Yes, I would say listening to not just the loudest voices, but trying to listen to generally more voices and putting the burden kind of on us as humanitarians to kind of make that, to cover that gap and go to communities. So I'm thinking of the project that we're doing in Mongolia, and really thinking about, for instance, the herder families that maybe aren't on social media, but they have one smartphone per family. And what does that mean to use a smartphone together with so many different people? And really understanding what is it that they actually want from these digital tools, and how do they fit into their lives, rather than us coming up with solutions in isolation.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would love to give the final word to Secretary General Sandy, who is there in Nairobi right now, and Patricia to close us out, and just to say my final thank you to everyone that's joined today. It's been really a pleasure on being able to moderate this session with all of you and hear your perspectives and hear the questions from the group. But finally, over to you, Secretary General Sandy and Patricia to take us home.
Thank you very much. At the national society level, my thoughts are that there is need for investment in leadership to drive digital solutions. Most of our leaders, not just at HQ levels, but at branches, have a level of unwillingness, and as long as that is there, it's difficult to drive these changes. So like the colleague from the Kenyan Red Cross said, there are already lots of good solutions within our movement. What we need is that desire, that willingness of our leaders to learn what's succeeding in other national society, what's happening, what can we learn and what can we localize to help us reach more people, serve them better, and adapt to the changes. And also there is this trend within our national societies. In some way we are a political institution. Leaders come and they go after a few years. And if these drives are not deeply entrenched into the national society, then one or two people who are interested in digital solutions will try some things, and as soon as they're gone, those initiatives die. So I think it's time to really invest in youth, because they are the leaders of the future, but also to invest in all levels of our leadership, that in creativity, in innovation, finding ideas that will work, finding ways to reach more people. I think if we do that consistently in a structured manner, there is a lot of potential. And we as national societies, more than other institutions in the humanitarian world, are better placed to succeed with these initiatives and these solutions because of our spread within the countries we are. Our volunteers are in all regions, which makes it very easy for those solutions to be tried, and even issues relating to data, we are better placed to harness those strengths and serve communities better. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Sandy. Thank you very much to everyone for participating to this session. Thank you to people on YouTube who followed this session. I think for me today, one key takeaway is people, putting people at the center, meaning designing programs, designing products, services, really that comes and that respond to their needs. This brings us to consulting the communities, understanding their needs. Yeah, I think that would be it. So I think we're 12 now. Time for lunch. Thank you very much again for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.